Hi, my name is Tim McBride. From 1985 until 1990, I was the personal aide or private secretary to George H.W. Bush, President of the United States. I was with him during the last 3.5 years that he was Vice President and the first year and a half of his presidency. During that time, we traveled more than 1 million miles together. It was my job to keep him on schedule, worry about the logistics, make sure he had all the briefing materials for all of his important meetings. I was with him on that important visit to Budapest in July of 1989. For all the travels we did, I've forgotten a lot, but that is one visit that stands out in my memory for so many reasons. I'm not sure I understood the significance, the historical significance for the Hungarian people and for relations between the U.S. and Hungary at the time, but I certainly do now. We had flown from Warsaw to Budapest, and of course I was worrying about the logistics, the next stop, what we had to do, and didn't fully realize or understand or appreciate the degree to which the Hungarian people were gathering in Kossuth Square to meet the president and to be part of this historic visit. He was there, of course, to pay respect to the early efforts by the Hungarian people toward freedom, and he wanted to show his appreciation for that. As we were approaching Budapest, we understood the storms had scattered the crowds, and we circled a little bit before we landed in Budapest. But we landed, it was still raining, and we got word that the crowds had reassembled in the square, that they were not deterred by the pouring rain. The President and Mrs. Bush were announced out on the stage. It was still raining then, and the President gave a beautiful welcoming remarks, but I could tell from President Bush's face that he feared it might be going too long given all that the crowd had endured. And so he was worried about the discomfort of the people and wanting to really express his feelings. So I wasn't exactly surprised when he tore up the speech, although I was a little bit concerned. The real concern was that maybe he left something out that was important to signal, or in some way said something from extemporaneously that might have sent the wrong signal. But that wasn't the case at all. What he was able to convey was the warmth of his expression, what it meant to him to have that welcome by the Hungarian people on that special day. For his part, he was there to underscore how much he valued, respected, appreciated the efforts at the democratization that the Hungarian people had begun to take, at great risk to themselves. Shortly after his speech, he tears up the speech, gives his speech from his heart. He goes off stage to greet people along the rope line, and it was the practice that I would join him and the Secret Service in case he needed something while he's shaking hands. Well, you may know he gave up his raincoat for an elderly lady he saw on the rope line. He was concerned she was wet and cold, and he said to her, "Here's my coat, take my coat." What you may not know, however, it wasn't his coat. He had borrowed it from one of the Secret Service agents. I had screwed up and had forgotten to bring his own coat, and so before he went out on stage, he borrowed one of the coats from the agents. Well, I was horrified that he was giving away a coat that wasn't his, so I started quietly arguing with him. "Mr. President, you can't give that coat away, it's not yours." He said, "I'm giving it to this lady." Well, he did give it to the lady, and later he wrote a check and sent a picture of him in the coat to the Secret Service agent, who was generous enough to loan the coat to him. But it was really typical of President Bush, his concern for others. And tearing up the speech had the same significance. It was all about his not wanting the people to be discomforted. He also felt like he could express what was really on his mind more directly than being tied to the speech cards. Well, my fondest memory of traveling to Budapest for that historic trip, besides the greeting from the Hungarian people and the determination of the people to welcome President Bush, was the gift that he received from the Hungarian people. He received a plaque that contained a piece of the Iron Curtain on it, a piece of barbed wire. He was moved by that gift, and every visitor to the White House for weeks after his visit would get a view of that, would get a look at that plaque. He would tell them about the visit to Budapest and how important that visit was. He was so proud of that plaque with that piece of the Iron Curtain. It said to me that something really important had gone on there. And of course, a year later, the world was an entirely different place, led in part by the courageous efforts of the Hungarian people. Well, there's a couple of things that stand out for me as I think back on my time working as Mr. Bush's aide. First was a sense of humor. It didn't come across to the American people or publicly all that well, but he had a great sense of humor. He and Barbara Bush loved to laugh and found humor in most everything. Well, the most special memory I have of having worked for Mr. Bush dates us back to Inauguration Day, the day he was inaugurated president, January 20th, 1989. As part of the inauguration ceremony, the President-elect and Mrs. Bush traveled to the White House to greet President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan, the outgoing president. And then together they travel up to the Capitol for the ceremony that follows. Well, on the way to the car, President-elect Bush said to me, "I'm not going to need my overcoat." It was a somewhat temperate day, and he didn't think he would need it for his swearing in. So we left it in the trunk of the limousine down on the plaza at the Capitol. Well, just moments before he and President Reagan are to be escorted out onto the platform for the inauguration ceremony, President Reagan is being bundled up by Mrs. Reagan. She's putting a scarf on him. He has his overcoat on. And President-elect Bush said to me, "I need my overcoat." Well, I said, "Sir, that's not possible. I can't get to the car, bring your coat back in time in order to stay on schedule. You'll already be on stage." His real concern, though, was, I can't look hardier than President Reagan going out on stage. Even in that moment, arguably one of the most important days of his life, if not the most important day, his real concern was to not looking hardier than President Reagan or in somehow drawing a negative contrast to somebody he cared a great deal for.
Great, thank you very much.